The darkness of the night enveloped the depths of a desolate forest. The cold air seeped through the thin coat of an old man named Edward. His trembling hands clutched a small lamp, barely illuminating a few steps ahead. As Edward trudged forward, exhausted, he heard a sudden rustling in the silence. At first, he thought it was a wolf, but when he turned toward the sound, his eyes froze. It was a massive lion. This couldn't be a coincidence. Why was Edward at his age deep in the forest? And why was the lion standing motionless, staring directly at him? Edward was a man who lived alone in the forest. Most of his life had been spent there after losing his family in a tragic accident. However, that day Edward had ventured into the forest for a different reason than usual. He had received a letter from a nearby town, sharing the dying wish of an old friend. The letter claimed that a child in the depths of the forest was in desperate need of help. Edward, carrying the guilt of a past mistake, took on this dangerous mission. But this journey would bring him face to face with a creature unlike any he had ever encountered. The lion's eyes held no threat, but instead seemed to carry a message. But what was that message? As Edward hesitated and tried to step back, the lion slowly approached him. To his surprise, the lion didn't roar or attack. Instead, it lowered its head and placed a paw on the ground, as if pointing to something. Edward looked closely and saw it, a large bloodstain. The lion's actions seemed to be guiding him somewhere. Edward paused, staring at the lion, unsure of what to do. "Are you trying to lead me somewhere?" he whispered. The lion's head tilted slightly, almost as if nodding. This was a moment of trust, an unspoken guidance. The lion began leading Edward deeper into the forest. As they walked, Edward somehow felt that the lion meant no harm. Yet, uncertainty and fear still lingered within him as he didn't know where they were going. Along the way, the bloodstains on the ground became more frequent. Eventually, they reached a clearing. There, Edward saw a small child lying on the ground. The child was unconscious and trapped in a hunter's snare. The trap was large and brutal, and the lion's paw bore scars of its attempt to free the child. Edward, horrified, rushed to the child and carefully began to release the trap. Meanwhile, the lion stood guard, watching over the boy with quiet vigilance. Once Edward freed the child and gently picked him up, he noticed that the boy was still breathing. However, the child's condition was severe. Edward quickly decided to carry him to safety. The lion continued to walk beside them as if protecting both Edward and the child. Along the way, Edward couldn't help but wonder why this animal would do such a thing. How could a wild animal show such mercy? He thought to himself. Yet a deeper question gnawed at his mind. Why was this child here, and how had he ended up in such danger? Carrying the child in his arms, Edward managed to navigate his way out of the forest. As the village lights came into view, a group of villagers ran to meet them. They had heard about the missing child, but couldn't believe that a lion had helped protect him. When Edward told them what had happened, the villagers were both shocked and moved. But Edward noticed something else. The lion remained at the edge of the forest, quietly watching them. There was something in its eyes. It was as if the lion wanted to say something, but Edward couldn't understand it, yet. The child's family was found and reunited with him in the village. The boy's father approached Edward, his voice trembling with gratitude. "This is my son. We don't know how he ended up in the forest, but we can't thank you enough," he said. Yet Edward's mind was still preoccupied with the lion's actions. That night, Edward decided to return to the forest where the lion had been waiting. When he found it, the lion's gaze was calmer now. Edward knelt down and began tending to the wound on its paw. That's when he noticed something. An old scar around the lion's neck. Looking closer, Edward recognized the scar. Years ago, in his youth as a hunter, he had caused that very wound. In that moment, Edward understood everything. This lion was the same animal he had once wounded while hunting. Despite this, the lion had risked its life to save him and the child. Tears filled Edward's eyes. You forgave me," he said softly. The lion slowly lowered its head and closed its eyes. It was a farewell. This story became a legend in the village. People began calling it the Forgiving Lion, and the tale was passed down through generations. Edward spent the rest of his life sharing this story and reflecting on the lesson the lion had taught him about mercy. Before he passed away, Edward would often say, "Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the quietest beings." And the story of the Forgiving Lion was never forgotten.